The rope bit into his hands before the light had fully come up over the ridge. Below him, the cliff dropped away close to 400 feet, down to broken coral and a knot of litter-bearers waiting in the shadow of the rock. Above him, on the flat top of the Maeda Escarpment, there was not a single rifle left that belonged to his company. The men who could still walk had gone back down hours before. What stayed on the summit was the dead, the wounded who could not move themselves, the Japanese working through their tunnels a short throw away, and one soldier from Lynchburg, Virginia, who had never in his life carried a gun. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. His name was Desmond Doss. He was a company aidman, a medic, and on the morning of May 5th, 1945, he was doing the one thing he believed he had been sent to that ridge to do. He had pulled another wounded man to the lip of the cliff. He worked a rope under the man's arms and around his thighs, tying it off in a knot he had found almost by accident in training, a double bowline that would hold a body without cinching down and crushing it. He set his boots against the stone. He lowered the man down the rock face, hand over hand, into the reach of the soldiers waiting below. Then, by his own telling, he said the prayer he had been saying since the first shells came down. "Lord, please help me get one more." He would keep at it for the better part of 12 hours. One man, then the prayer, then back out across open ground that machine guns and mortars had already zeroed to find the next one. By the time it was over, the Army would credit Desmond Doss with bringing 75 men off that escarpment, and the number itself would turn into an argument, which we will get to. This is the story that popular memory has pressed down into one image. A thin, soft-spoken pacifist, alone on a cliff, saving the men who once wanted him gone, while thousands of the enemy closed in around him. The image is not false. It is only smaller than what happened, and in a few of its details, it is not what happened at all. The man carried no weapon. That part is true, and it holds up everything that follows. The familiar version says he had no orders. The record shows he had a clear order that morning, the order to pull back off the ridge with everyone else, and that he would not obey it. The figure of 4,000 sounds exact and is not. What the documents describe is a tunneled cliff held by thousands of dug-in Japanese soldiers. An American battalion bled, nearly to nothing trying to take it, and a choice one unarmed man made when the line came apart and the top of the escarpment was handed back to the enemy and to the men too broken to crawl. So before the rope and the prayer, we should go back to the cliff, to the war that made it matter, and to the man who walked up it with a Bible and a kit bag and nothing else. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was nearly finished. In the Pacific, it was not. The next move in the American plan was Okinawa, a long island in the Ryukyus a little more than 300 miles off the Japanese mainland. Whoever held Okinawa would hold the airfields and the anchorages for the invasion of Japan itself, and both sides knew it. The landings came on April 1st, 1945, under the codename Operation Iceberg. Across the months of fighting, more than 500,000 Allied personnel would take part. Waiting for them were roughly 100,000 troops of the Japanese 32nd Army under Lieutenant General Mitsu Ushijima, and Ushijima had not strung his men along the beaches to be shelled apart by the fleet. He had drawn them back into the rocky southern third of the island and dug them into a chain of defensive lines built around the old castle town of Shuri. The Shuri defenses were designed to make the Americans buy every yard. Hills and ridges were turned into honeycombs of caves, tunnels, and firing positions. The guns laid so that they covered one another, so that no single position could be reduced without first dealing with three more. One of the hardest points in the whole system was a flat-topped ridge the Japanese named for the village on its reverse slope, Maeda. The Americans had their own names. The Maeda Escarpment, the Big Escarpment. Before long, the men climbing it would call it Hacksaw Ridge. Okinawa was the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War, and the fighting did not stay on the ground. Out at sea, the Japanese threw waves of kamikaze aircraft at the American and British fleet, sinking ships and killing sailors by the thousands across the campaign, so that the men on the cliffs and the men on the water were both being worn down at the same time. On land, the defenders had refined a way of fighting that made ground like the Maeda Escarpment so expensive. Rather than hold the forward slope, where naval guns and aircraft could see them and break them, the Japanese fought from the reverse slope and from inside the hill, letting the attackers crest the ridge and then killing them from positions the bombardment could not touch. To take a place like that, the infantry had to come over the top into the worst of it and clear the tunnels by hand, one cave at a time. That was the ground the 77th inherited at Maeda. The escarpment was a sheer cliff, by most accounts around 400 feet from base to crest. The last 35 feet near the top formed an overhang, near vertical, so steep that the infantry could not simply scramble up it. Engineers slung cargo nets over the lip, and the riflemen went up the netting one at a time, hand over hand, with their weapons across their backs in a fire. The flat crown of the ridge looked deceptively quiet. Underneath it, the Japanese had bored a maze of tunnels and chambers that let them appear, fire, and vanish to the reverse slope, then surface again somewhere new. A unit history of the 77th Division recorded that after a tank put a round of white phosphorus into one bunker, within about 15 minutes smoke was seen leaking from more than 30 other hidden openings along the slope. The hill was not a position so much as a single connected fortress, and behind it sat the headquarters of the entire 32nd Army. At Shuri, the 96th Infantry Division reached the escarpment first and began trying to take it around April 26th. They cannot. The cliff and the men inside it were that strong. Soldiers of the 96th were thrown off the top, some of them weeping, some of them saying they would not go back up, and then going back up anyway. The 96th had landed under strength and had taken brutal losses, and by the end of April it was spent. The Army relieved it with a fresher division, the 77th, which had already fought through the smaller islands offshore and on Ie Shima, where the war correspondent Ernie Pyle had been killed by machine gun fire on April 18th. Now, the 77th was handed the cliff that had broken the division before it. One of the medics who climbed it was Desmond Doss, and to understand why a man would do what he did up there, you have to start a long way from Okinawa. Desmond Thomas Doss was born on February 7th, 1919, in Lynchburg, Virginia, the middle of 3 children. His father was a carpenter who drank and could turn hard, his mother a homemaker and shoe factory worker who held the family together with her faith. The Dosses were Seventh-day Adventists. Desmond grew up with the 10 Commandments on the wall and with a particular weight given to the 6th of them, the commandment against killing. His mother taught him that taking a life was among the worst things a person could do, and the lesson took root in him in a way that never loosened. The 2016 film about him, Hacksaw Ridge, ties his refusal to kill to a single scene from his childhood, a fight in which his father pulls a gun on his mother. The real event was close to that, but not the same. By the account preserved in the Encyclopedia of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the violence that marked young Desmond came during a fight in which his father aimed a gun at Desmond's uncle. His mother stepped in, took the weapon away, and handed it to Desmond to hide. He held a gun in his hands that day so that no one would be shot with it. He would spend the rest of his life unwilling to hold one for any other reason. The film compressed and rewrote the moment for the screen. The conviction underneath, it was his own, and it was real. When the United States went to war, Doss was working at the Newport News shipyard, building ships for the Navy. That job came with a deferment. He could have stayed home with a clear legal standing, and no one would have called him a coward to his face. He did not want it. He believed the war against fascism was a just war and that he had a duty to take part in it. What he would not do was kill. He let himself be drafted in the spring of 1942, and he reported for the Army. And from the first day, he set himself a line he would not cross. He would wear the uniform. He would salute the flag. He would go anywhere they sent him and do any work that saved life rather than took it. He simply would not carry a weapon, and he would not work on his Sabbath, which as a Seventh-day Adventist he kept on Saturday. He disliked the label Conscientious Objector. He thought it sounded like a man objecting to service, and he was not objecting to anything. He called himself a conscientious cooperator. The Army did not know what to do with him, and a good part of the Army hated him for it. In training, he was harassed by the men around him and by some of his officers. Soldiers threw boots and shoes at him while he knelt to pray at night. One man told him plainly that when they got into combat, he would make sure Doss did not come back alive. His commanders tried to be rid of him through official channels. One attempt sought to discharge him for a mental condition, a Section 8, and Doss refused to accept it, saying his beliefs were religious and that he was not unstable for wanting to keep them. Another officer moved to court-martial him for refusing to handle a rifle. When that failed too, he was denied leave out of spite, which nearly cost him the chance to see his brother Harold before Harold shipped out with the Navy. Doss did not bend on any of it. He later put his reasoning simply. He knew that if he ever compromised once, he could compromise again, and so he would not compromise at all. He had married a young woman named Dorothy Shuri in 1942, and he carried a small Bible she had given him through everything that came next. It is worth being clear about what the Army asked of a medic because it explains the size of what Doss took on. A company aidman went in a battle with bandages, sulfa powder, morphine, plasma, and his hands, and his work began at the moment everyone else was trying to get down. When a soldier fell in the open, the medic went to him in the open. He had no way to shoot back, and in Doss's case, no wish to. The men who had thrown shoes at him in the barracks learned this by degrees. The same conviction that made him useless to them as a rifleman made him the man they wanted crawling toward them when they were hit, and on Guam and Leyte, they had watched him do precisely that. By the time the division reached Okinawa, the medic no one had wanted in his foxhole had become the one they hoped would be close by when their own luck ran out. What came next was the Pacific. In 1944, Doss shipped out as a medic attached to the 307th Infantry Regiment of the 77th Infantry Division, assigned to Company B. Okinawa was not his first taste of combat, though it is the one history remembers. The division fought first on Guam in the summer of 1944, and there the men who had threatened him in training began to learn what they had in him. Doss went out under fire to reach wounded men and brought them back, and for it he was awarded the Bronze Star for valor. The regiment fought again at Leyte in the Philippines, and again Doss did the same work in the same way, and was awarded a second Bronze Star. He also picked up something on Leyte that he did not yet know he carried, an infection of tuberculosis that would shape the rest of his life. By the time the 77th reached Okinawa, the doubts in his own company had mostly worn away. The men knew the medic with no rifle would come for them if they went down, and that was worth more than any argument about the commandments. The film built around all of this. Mel Gibson's Hacksaw Ridge got a great deal right, and that is worth saying plainly because this channel exists in part to separate the movie from the record, and here the two run closer together than usual. The picture honored his faith without mocking it and without scrubbing it away. It showed the harassment, the near court-martial, the refusal to touch a weapon, and the rescues on the ridge, and his only son later called its accuracy remarkable. But it is still a Hollywood film, and it took the liberties Hollywood takes. It changed the childhood scene, as we have seen. It left out Guam and Leyte entirely, so that the audience meets a man going into his first battle when the real Doss was already a decorated veteran of two. It shows him treating a wounded enemy soldier, and whether that happened is not clear. Doss himself said he once tried to help a wounded Japanese man and that the man pulled a gun on him, so he left. Some of his fellow soldiers remembered seeing a Japanese man with an American bandage on him. The record does not settle it, and so we should not pretend it does. And then there is the number. The single most repeated fact about Desmond Doss is that he saved 75 men on Hacksaw Ridge. It is in his Medal of Honor citation. It is on the monuments and in the film's closing titles. What is less often said is that 75 is a compromise. By the account in the Encyclopedia of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and in the Library of Virginia's record of him, Doss himself believed he had brought down no more than 50. His commanders thought the true figure was closer to 100. Unable to agree, they split the difference and wrote down 75, and that is the number that went into the citation and into history. This is not a small thing to notice. It does not shrink what he did. It tells you something honest about how even the most carefully awarded medals are built, partly from the fog of the thing itself, where no one was counting, where a man was simply going back out for one more. There is one detail the calendar can confirm on its own. The heaviest day of his rescues fell on May 5th, 1945, and May 5th, 1945 was a Saturday, the Sabbath he had fought the entire army to keep. The film dramatizes a scene in which his captain tells him a fresh assault is set for Saturday and that the men will not go up without him, and the whole company waits in something like reverence while Doss prays. How exactly that played out on the real ridge is harder to pin down than the movie suggests, and it draws partly on Doss's own later telling. But the bones of it are not invented. The man who would not work on his Sabbath spent his Sabbath that made doing the hardest labor of his life, and he understood the work as the highest form of keeping it. To see what that labor actually was, we have to go up the cliff with the 307th. The regiment moved into the line at the end of April and started up the escarpment. The official Army history of the campaign records the cost in figures that are hard to take in. The 1st Battalion of the 307th Infantry went up onto the escarpment on April 29th at a strength of about 800 men. When it came back down on May 7th, it numbered 324. In one stretch of 36 hours on that hilltop, no fewer than 8 company commanders were wounded. These are the men around Doss. This is the part the single heroic image tends to lose. He did not work in an empty diorama with one brave man and a faceless enemy. He worked inside one of the worst small actions of the Pacific War, among riflemen who were being killed and maimed in numbers that gutted whole companies in days. After a company was nearly wiped out in the first attempts on the crest, what was left of it joined with Doss's B Company and went up the cargo nets to the top on May 2nd. The fighting there did not look like the movies for the most part. It was close, and it was patient, and it was lethal. The Japanese held the reverse slope in the tunnels and let the Americans come over the lip, then cut them down and pulled back underground. Engineers and demolition teams went at the cave mouths with explosives and flamethrowers and white phosphorus, sealing one opening only to have fire come from another. A strong point the Americans nicknamed the apartment house had to be taken yard by yard and was not cleared until May 5th. Japanese machine gun fire across that open ground was heavy enough that the museum record notes one American soldier was decapitated by it. Into that, again and again, went a medic with no rifle. The days on the crest blurred into one long fight that the official history sets down in the plain arithmetic of attrition. Ground taken in daylight could be lost again after dark, when Japanese troops climbed back up through their tunnels into positions the Americans believed they had cleared. The 77th's engineers and infantry answered with satchel charges and flame, blasting tunnel mouths shut and burning out the chambers, and the Japanese opened new ones. Men went up the cargo nets under fire to reach the top, and men were brought back down the same nets when they were hit, if they could be reached at all. The losses on that hilltop were not the work of one bad afternoon. They were the steady cost of a fortress that had to be taken apart by hand, and they fell on one company after another until the rifle platoons were a shadow of their landing strength. This was the place Desmond Doss kept walking into without a weapon to bring the hit men out. Doss did one thing on that ridge that tells you how clearly he understood his odds. He took off the markings that showed he was a medic. On most battlefields, a red cross was a measure of protection. Here was the opposite. Japanese troops had learned that killing the medic could cost the Americans far more than one man, because the wounded he would have saved would die without him. So Doss stripped the signs of his trade and went out looking like any other target, which is what he had become. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. That wait was not random. By early May, the Japanese command at Shuri had decided to stop trading ground and to strike back instead. Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, Ushijima's chief of staff, pressed for a general counteroffensive, and the plan made the Maeda sector one of its main objects, with fresh infantry, tanks, and a heavy artillery bombardment ordered up to retake the escarpment and the village behind it. The attack went in around May 4th. It was one of the few times in the whole campaign that the Japanese came out of their caves in strength to fight in the open, and it cost them terribly when American artillery and armor caught their formations in daylight. The offensive failed and bled the defenders white. But before it broke, it threw exactly the kind of pressure onto the crest that drove the American line back on May 5th and left Doss alone with the wounded. The day everything turned was May 5th. On the American crest, the fire reached a level where holding was no longer possible, and the order came to get off the top. The men who could move went back over the lip and down. And here is the moment the famous title gets wrong while pointing at something true. Doss was not a man without orders. He had been ordered down with the rest. He looked at the wounded who could not go with him. Men he knew, men with families waiting for them, men who had trusted him to come when they fell, and he decided that his own life was not worth more than theirs. So he stayed. He would later say it plainly, that he had those men up there and he should not leave them. What he did over the next 12 hours is set down, in part, in the words of his Medal of Honor citation, which is a government record and not a screenwriter's invention. As the troops had gained the summit, a concentration of artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire had crashed into them, inflicting around 75 casualties and driving the rest back. Doss refused cover. He stayed in the fire-swept area with the wounded and carried them one by one to the edge of the escarpment, and there he lowered them on a rope-supported litter down the face of the cliff to the men below. One by one, across open ground, under fire the whole time. He had no way to evacuate them except his own back and the knot he had taught himself, that double bowline he had found in training, looping it under arms and thighs so the rope would hold a broken man without strangling him, and easing each one down 400 feet of rock while he braced at the top and prayed the only prayer he had room for. "Lord, please help me get one more." Then he went back for the next. The citation records the days around that one in the same flat, terrible language. On May 2nd, he had gone out to bring in a wounded man lying 200 yards forward of the lines on that same escarpment, deep in a ground the enemy held. 2 days later, on May 4th, he treated 4 men who had been cut down assaulting a strongly defended cave, working his way forward through a shower of grenades to within 8 yards of the Japanese in the cave's mouth, dressing the wounds where the men had fallen, and then making 4 separate trips under fire to carry them out. On May 5th itself, before or between the work on the cliff, he braved shelling and small arms fire to reach an artillery officer who had been hit, bandaged him, moved him to cover, and gave him plasma while the shells came down nearby. Later that same day, when another American was badly wounded by fire from a cave, Doss crawled to where the man lay 25 feet from the enemy position, treated him, and carried him 100 yards to safety while exposed the entire way. Hold on the picture for a moment, because it is the whole point of telling this. There is no weapon anywhere in it. There is no covering fire that he provides, because he provides none. There is a thin man crossing and recrossing ground that has been turned into a killing field, kneeling beside torn bodies in the open, and carrying them out on a rope and on his shoulders, one after another, for half a day, while the cliff top belongs to the men who are trying to kill him. He did not turn the battle. He did not take the ridge. Other men with rifles and flamethrowers and demolition charges did that, and many of them died doing it, and they deserve to be in this story too. What Doss did was refuse to let the wounded be the price of the retreat. He treated the saving of life as an order that outranked the order to come down, and he obeyed it until the top of the escarpment was empty of living Americans except the ones he was lowering and himself. There is one more place where the popular version slips, and it is worth setting right. The story is often told as a single night, one man saving 75 souls between dusk and dawn. The record is less tidy and, in its own way, larger. His Medal of Honor citation lays out actions across several days. The rescue on the cliff, and the man brought in from 200 yards out, and the 4 soldiers treated at the cave's mouth, and the artillery officer given plasma under fire. And then, more than 2 weeks later, the night near Shuri, where he was finally cut down himself. Doss did not perform one impossible night and walk away clean. He went back into that kind of danger again and again over most of a month, until a grenade and a sniper's bullet stopped him. The legend keeps the cliff and loses the weeks. The man lived the weeks. He came through that day without a scratch, which those who knew the ground found hard to believe then and have found hard to believe ever since. He stayed in the fight with B Company as the division pushed on past the Escarpment towards Shuri. His luck, if that is the word for it, held until May 21st. That night his company was in a night attack on high ground near Shuri, and Doss did again exactly what he had done on the cliff. He stayed out in the open while the rest of the company took cover, moving among the wounded in the dark, knowing that an American moving around at night could easily be mistaken for an infiltrating Japanese soldier and shot by his own side. A grenade went off close to him and tore into his legs. Rather than call another medic out of cover and risk a second man, he treated his own wounds and lay there waiting. He waited 5 hours before litter bearers could reach him and start carrying him back. On the way, the small group was caught in a Japanese tank attack, and Doss, seeing a man nearby who was more badly hurt than he was, rolled off the litter and told the bearers to take the other man first. While he waited for them to come back for him, he was hit again, this time by a bullet that broke his arm. With nothing else to use, he bound a rifle stock to his shattered arm as a splint, the closest he ever came to making use of a weapon, and then he crawled 300 yards over rough ground to the aid station. He had been wounded by the grenade, then wounded again by the bullet, and still he had given up his place on the litter to a man worse off. He was evacuated in late May. His name, the citation says, had become a symbol throughout the 77th Division for gallantry far beyond the call of duty. His company commander, Captain Glover, who had been among those uneasy about him in the beginning, would later call him one of the bravest people alive. The Battle of Okinawa ground on until late June, one of the costliest of the entire war. The figures still carry their grief. By the accounts that came out of the campaign, the United States suffered more than 39,000 killed, wounded, and missing across the island. The Japanese dead were counted in the range of 100,000, with roughly another 10 to 11,000 taken prisoner, and the civilian dead of Okinawa were enormous and are still mourned. Those numbers are the ones usually cited. Unlike all such figures from a battle that size, they should be read as the best reckoning rather than an exact ledger. The point they make is not in dispute. The cliff that Doss climbed was one piece of slaughter, and the men he lowered down had survived something that killed tens of thousands around them. On October 12, 1945, President Harry Truman presented Desmond Doss with the Medal of Honor on the White House lawn. By Doss's account, Truman crossed the line to take his hand and shook it the way you would shake the hand of an old friend, and would not let him get nervous. Truman told him he was proud of him, that he really deserved it, and that he considered it a greater honor than being president. Doss became the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the nation's highest military decoration, and during the Second World War, he remained the only one. He understood the medal in his own terms. He said he believed he had received it because he had kept the golden rule, the verse from the Gospel of Matthew that says to do for others what you would have them do for you. The cost of the ridge did not stop with the medal. The tuberculosis he had carried out of Leyte caught up with him after the war. He was discharged from the Army in 1946 and then spent years inside hospitals rather than at home. The disease took one of his lungs and 5 of his ribs before it was done, and he lived the rest of his life on a single lung. The bullet wound in his arm never healed cleanly, which ended the carpentry work he had hoped to do, the trade of his father. In 1976, an overdose of antibiotics given to him under medical care left him completely deaf, and he lived in silence for years until a cochlear implant in 1988 returned some of his hearing. Through all of it, he raised a family on a small farm in Rising Fawn, Georgia, in the hills near Lookout Mountain. His first wife, Dorothy, the woman who had given him the small Bible he carried up the cliff, died in 1991 in a car accident while he was driving her to the hospital. He married again 2 years later. Honors found him across the decades. At the 100th anniversary of the Medal of Honor in 1962, the other living recipients chose Doss to represent them at a White House ceremony, where he sat and talked with President Kennedy. His story was kept alive for generations of Seventh-day Adventist children at summer camps, where he himself would sometimes teach a circle of kids the bowline knot he had used to lower 75 men off a cliff. A documentary about him, The Conscientious Objector, was released in 2004, and the Gibson film came in 2016, 10 years after his death, and carried his name to millions who had never heard it. He died on March 23, 2006, at his home in Piedmont, Alabama, at the age of 87, after being hospitalized for trouble breathing, the lung that had carried him so long finally failing. He was buried at the Chattanooga National Cemetery in Tennessee, where a horse-drawn caisson brought the flag-covered casket to the grave and helicopters passed overhead. What the record asks us to carry out of his story is not the clean myth. The clean myth says one saint stood alone against 4,000 and saved the day. The truer thing is harder and better. A man decided, before he ever saw a battlefield, that there was a line he would not cross even if the entire weight of the army leaned on him. And then he kept that line in the one place where keeping it should have gotten him killed. He did it surrounded not by an abstraction, but by other young men, his own and the enemy's, who were dying in a fortress of stone and tunnels for reasons their governments had decided. He did not save the 75, or the 50, or the 100 by being stronger or braver than the rifleman beside him. He saved them by valuing their lives over his own and refusing the order to leave, over and over, until there was no one left to carry. So remember the names. Remember Desmond Doss, the medic from Lynchburg who would not carry a gun and would not leave his wounded. Remember the men of the 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry, who went up that cliff 800 strong and came down barely a third of that, and the 8 company commanders who fell in a day and a half, most of whose names are not on any poster. Remember the men Doss lowered down the rock face, the ones he never counted because he was too busy going back for one more, who lived to go home because a man with no weapon decided they would. And remember, with the gravity it asks for, that the enemy in those tunnels were also young men sent to die on a hill, far from whoever was waiting for them. The record holds all of them. The least we can do is hold them too. Set the cliff aside for a moment, because there is a larger frame around it that the single image never shows. Desmond Doss settled his refusal to kill years before he ever reached Okinawa, and he was a long way from the only American who settled it the same way. Behind the lone medic on the escarpment stood a whole population of men who had reached that decision too, and almost none of their names came down to us. They are worth standing up, because they show that what Doss did was the rarest outcome of a choice thousands of his countrymen were quietly making all through the war. When the draft notice arrived, a man who could not bring himself to kill had only a few narrow roads open to him. By the counts that survive, somewhere between 40 and 70,000 American men registered as conscientious objectors across the years of the Second World War, the total shifting with how it is measured and who gets included. Most were steered into one of 2 official categories. The first kept a man in uniform and under military discipline, but assigned him to duty that did not require him to bear arms. The second pulled him out of the army altogether and into civilian labor the government called work of national importance. Roughly 25,000 chose the first road and served inside the armed forces carrying no weapon, the bulk of them as medics and chaplains, going to the places the shooting was and bringing nothing along to answer it. About 12,000 more took the civilian road, fighting wildfires, staffing the wards of mental hospitals, and in one bleak chapter offering their own bodies to science, including the 36 objectors who let themselves be slowly starved in a Minnesota laboratory so doctors could learn how to bring famine victims back. And around 6,000 refused all of it. They would not register and would not serve in any form, and they went to federal prison for the stand, more than 4,000 of them Jehovah's Witnesses. Doss carried that principle into the worst place it could be tested. He belonged to the first of those groups, the men who put on the uniform and turned down the rifle, although he could scarcely tolerate the label that came attached. He felt the phrase conscientious objector made him sound like someone shirking his duty, which was the last thing on his mind, and he asked to be called a conscientious cooperator instead. The Army recorded him under the non-combatant, heading nearly over his objection to the word. What the figures make clear is that the medic on the cliff was the most decorated member of a hidden army, the men who had resolved to risk their lives for the country without ever taking one in its name. The great majority went home unrecognized. A small number never went home at all. For more than 20 years after Okinawa, Doss stood by himself in one exact respect. He was the only conscientious objector in the nation's history to wear the Medal of Honor. Then America went to war in Vietnam, and a young man out of Morgantown, West Virginia, named Thomas Bennett walked nearly the identical path. Bennett had argued openly against the war as a college student, and a way around the draft was likely within reach, yet he would not shelter at home while others his age were sent to die. He enlisted as an objector who would still serve, trained as a medic, and joined a rifle company in the Central Highlands early in 1969. Across 3 days that February, near a place called Chupa, he did what Doss had done on the ridge. Each time his unit was ambushed, he ran out into the open to pull the wounded back, covering men with his own body while he treated them. On the morning of the 11th, he was killed going after one of them, cut down by enemy fire as he crossed open ground toward a man who had fallen. He was 21, and he had never fired a shot. His medal came after his death, and President Nixon set it in his parents' hands on a day that should have been Bennett's 23rd birthday. His mother nearly refused it, feeling that turning it away would honor how deeply her son had hated war, and accepted only because the soldiers who served beside him were the ones asking that he have it. He remains, with Doss, one of only 2 conscientious objectors ever to receive the decoration, and the only one to earn it in Vietnam. 2 decades stood between the medics, and they had run the same merciless sum, that a single unarmed man going back into the fire could be worth more than any weapon he might have held. There's one more thing the record lays in front of us, and it sits behind the entire Okinawa campaign. The island served a larger purpose. It was being taken as the launching ground for the invasion of Japan, the plan the staff officers called Downfall, whose opening blow was meant for the southern home island of Kyushu. Every ridge and tunnel on Okinawa was part of the price of a forward base for that landing. Once the 77th Division finished its work around Shuri, it withdrew to Cebu in the Philippines in the summer of 1945 and started training for the assault on Japan itself. Doss was already off the line by then, but the men he had lowered down the rock were being aimed squarely at the home islands, where the casualty projections climbed past anything Okinawa had cost. How many men that landing would have taken is an argument that has never been settled, then or since, with the estimates ranging widely depending on who drew them up. What no one disputes is that Kyushu was expected to be even worse than Okinawa. The atomic bombs and the surrender that August shut the door on that landing before the order could be given. The 77th sailed to Japan in October as an occupation force. The invasion it had drilled for quietly shelved, and the division was stood down for good the next spring. So the labor Doss performed on the Escarpment bought the men he saved more than a ticket home. For some of them, it marked the gap between the cliff they had already lived through and a Kyushu beach that history, as it turned out, never asked anyone to storm. The final struggle over Desmond Doss was the struggle to put his story on a screen without hollowing it out, and it ran on nearly the length of his life. Hollywood had been after him almost from the hour Truman took his hand, and for 1 decade after another his answer stayed no. He had no taste for publicizing himself, and he worried that a studio would take the unadorned man he was and inflate him into something louder and less true, and he wanted any credit there was to land on God rather than on him. What changed his mind, when it finally changed, was a friendship. A documentary maker named Terry Benedict, who had read about Doss as a boy and never let the story go, spent years just keeping company with the old soldier, and one afternoon in a grocery store parking lot in Chattanooga, he gave him his word that in handling the story he would answer to God first and to Doss next, and let everybody else wait their place in line. Doss laughed and agreed, and the documentary came out of that. Even after Doss died, the feature picture sat in limbo for years. At one stage, a studio wanted the battle file down to a softer rating, and the people steering the project walked off rather than smooth away the very thing that gave the man his meaning, the plain horror of the ground he kept entering with empty hands. When the film at last reached theaters and then the Academy Award stage, it did the thing Benedict had sworn it would. It carried the name of a quiet Virginia medic to millions who had never once heard it, and carried it down mostly whole. That, in the end, is the hardest thing to keep whole. Across 80 years, a war, a long quarrel over a number, and a film that took half a century to reach the screen, the piece that blurs first is the simplest one, the shape of the decision sitting under all of it. A man can lay down his own right to fight back and still be the steadiest figure on the field. The legend shrinks that down to a single man on a single cliff. The record keeps handing back more than that. The thousands who made the same quiet choice and were never decorated for it. The second medic who followed him into the same fire and did not come home. The whole invasion, those rescued men were spared. All of it traces to a handful of ordinary people who decided they would sooner die helping than live by killing, and then went out and proved they meant it. Sources consulted the National World War II Museum, Alternative Service, Conscientious Objectors, and Civilian Public Service in World War II. Source for the conscientious objector population, the split between non-combatant military service and civilian work of national importance, and the roughly 12,000 men in the Civilian Public Service Program. Veterans Breakfast Club, conscientious objectors were human guinea pigs in World War II and study. Conscientious objector, definition, status, and examples. Sources for the approximate figures: around 43,000 registered, about 25,000 in non-combatant roles, roughly 6,000 imprisoned with over 4,400 of them Jehovah's Witnesses, and the Minnesota Semi-Starvation Study, using objector volunteers. EWV, the West Virginia Encyclopedia, Tom Bennett, the Thomas W. Bennett Papers, West Virginia University Archives, and the Wikipedia entry on Thomas W. Bennett, conscientious objector. Sources for Bennett's background in Morgantown, his enlistment as a non-combatant medic, his unit, Company B, 1st Battalion, 14th Infantry, 4th Infantry Division, and his death near Chupa on February 11, 1969. Edward F. Murphy, A Conscientious Objector's Medal of Honor, Vietnam Magazine, HistoryNet, and the Clio, Thomas W. Bennett, 1947 to 1969. Sources for Bennett being the second conscientious objector and the only Vietnam objector to receive the Medal of Honor, the posthumous award presented by President Nixon to his parents on what would have been his 23rd birthday, and his mother's initial reluctance to accept it. United States Army Center of Military History, World War II Divisional Combat Chronicles, 77th Infantry Division, and the Wikipedia entry on the Battle of Okinawa. Sources for Okinawa as a staging ground for the planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, with Kyushu as the first objective. The 77th Divisions moved to Cebu to prepare for that landing. Its arrival in Japan for occupation duty in October 1945, and its inactivation on March 15, 1946. CBN, Hacksaw Ridge producer remembers World War II hero Desmond Doss. The Hoya, producer Terry Benedict on Hacksaw Ridge, Desmond Doss, and Pathos interviews with Terry Benedict. Sources for Doss declining film offers for decades. His wish that any glory go to God. The grocery store parking lot conversation in Chattanooga, and Benedict's promise that became the documentary. Yahoo Entertainment, how Hacksaw Ridge finally captured the unbelievable story of reluctant war hero Desmond Doss. And all that's interesting, the true story of Hacksaw Ridge and Desmond Doss. Sources for the project's long stall in development. The dispute over softening the film to a PG-13 rating and the producer's refusal, the Desmond Doss Council's handling of his affairs, and the account of many producers approaching him over the years. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the